Tyler had never spent a day of his life struggling. Born into wealth, raised in a mansion with golden chandeliers, and spoiled with the finest things money could buy, he was the epitome of privilege. But tonight, standing in the cold, wearing nothing but thrift store clothes and clutching a tattered backpack, he was about to experience a world he had only seen through the tinted windows of his father's limousine. It had started as a joke, a bet between him and his best friend, Chase. "Dude, you wouldn't last a day without your credit card." Chase had laughed over their $100 stakes. Tyler, always up for a challenge, had smirked. "I bet I could survive a week on the streets." The room had erupted in laughter. No one believed he could do it. But now, here he was, alone, cold, broke. The plan was simple. 1 week living as a homeless person, no money, no help, no connections, just himself and whatever he could find. If he made it, Chase would donate $50,000 to a homeless shelter in his name. If he failed, Tyler would have to work at his father's company, a fate worse than death in his eyes. The first few hours weren't so bad. The city buzzed around him, and for the first time in years, he felt invisible. No reporters, no cameras. No one cared who he was. He almost enjoyed it. But as the night deepened, reality set in. His stomach growled. His fingers stiffened against the cold. His designer sneakers, now caked in grime, felt useless against the cracked pavement. The city that once looked so glamorous now felt like a maze of indifference. And the worst part? No one even looked at him. Tyler had never been ignored before. Now, he was just another shadow among the forgotten. As the hours passed, Tyler's confidence faded with the warmth of the sun. The streets, once vibrant and full of life, turned into a cold, unforgiving place. The air smelled of damp concrete and desperation. He pulled his hoodie tighter around his face, realizing for the first time just how loud the city was at night. Cars rushed by without stopping. People walked past, eyes glued to their phones, stepping around him like he was an obstacle, not a person. He sat on the steps of a closed coffee shop, watching as a businessman tossed a half-eaten sandwich into a trash can. Tyler's stomach twisted. For the first time in his life, he wondered if he could eat someone else's leftovers. He shook his head. No, this was just a game, a challenge. He could handle one night without food, right? A few feet away, an old man with a long gray beard and sunken eyes sat leaning against a brick wall, bundled in layers of torn jackets. His presence made Tyler uneasy. He had never been this close to a homeless person before. "First night?" the man asked, his voice raspy. Tyler hesitated. Did he look that obvious? "Yeah," the man chuckled. "Ain't gonna lie to you, kid. It doesn't get easier." Tyler tried to force a smirk. "I'll be fine." The man studied him, then shrugged. "Hope you got a good spot to sleep." Tyler hadn't thought about that. Where was he supposed to sleep? The ground? A bench? The thought made his skin crawl. He stood up and started walking, his sneakers scuffing against the pavement. The cold bit through his hoodie, chilling him to the bone. The city felt different now, harsher, meaner. He had always thought of it as his playground. Now it felt like a trap. By 3 a.m., his exhaustion won. He curled up under an overpass, using his backpack as a pillow. The concrete was harder than he imagined. Sleep didn't come easily. Somewhere in the distance, a bottle shattered. Laughter, yelling, footsteps approaching. Tyler's body tensed. For the first time in his life, he was truly afraid. Tyler barely slept. Every noise jolted him awake. The distant sirens, the drunken arguments, the sound of footsteps too close for comfort. His body ached from the hard concrete, and the cold seeped through his clothes, making him shiver uncontrollably. He had never felt so exposed. As the first rays of sunlight peeked over the skyline, he heard movement nearby. A group of men approached, their voices low, their laughter sharp. Tyler kept his head down, pretending to be asleep, but his heart pounded in his chest. They stopped a few feet away. "Yo, new kid on the block," one of them sneered. "You in our spot." Tyler sat up slowly, trying not to show fear. 3 men stood before him. Dirty clothes, rough hands, eyes that had seen too much. I didn't know," he muttered. His voice sounded small, weak. One of them scoffed. "You better learn fast. Out here, everything has a price." Before Tyler could react, a foot slammed against his backpack, knocking it away from him. His only belongings spilled onto the ground. A cheap blanket, a water bottle, a single dollar bill. One of the men bent down, snatching the dollar and holding it up. "Looks like payday." Tyler's fist clenched. Back in his world, no one dared to take anything from him. But this wasn't his world. "Let him be." A voice cut through the tension. The old man from last night stepped forward, his tired eyes locked onto the group. The men hesitated. Something about him carried weight. After a moment, they backed off, muttering curses as they disappeared into the city. Tyler let out a shaky breath. His hands were trembling. The old man sighed, shaking his head. "You really don't belong here." Tyler looked up at him, swallowing his pride. "Teach me." The old man, who introduced himself as Ray, studied Tyler with cautious eyes. "You want to learn? Fine. First lesson. You don't sleep out in the open like that." Tyler rubbed his arms, still shaken from the morning encounter. "Where else am I supposed to go?" Ray motioned for him to follow. They walked through the city streets, the morning sun offering little warmth. Tyler had never realized how many homeless people were around. Hidden in alleyways, huddled on benches, blending into the background of a world that ignored them. They stopped near an abandoned building, where a small group had gathered around a makeshift fire in a rusted barrel. Ray waved, and a few nodded back, acknowledging him. "This is a safe spot," Ray said. "No one messes with you here, long as you follow the rules." Tyler hesitated. He had never been part of a world that had unwritten rules before. "Like what?" "Respect," Ray said simply. "You don't steal, you don't start fights, and you don't act like you're better than anyone else." He eyed Tyler. "You listening, rich boy?" Tyler stiffened. "I told you, I'm not." Ray chuckled. "Kid, you scream privilege. But don't worry, the streets'll beat that out of you soon enough." Tyler clenched his jaw but didn't argue. He wasn't used to being the one at the bottom. One of the women at the fire offered Tyler a half-eaten sandwich. His stomach twisted with hunger. He hesitated. His whole life, he had thrown away food that wasn't perfect. Now, he was about to eat someone's leftovers. But as he took the first bite, the shame faded into something else. Survival. Ray watched him, nodding approvingly. Lesson 2. Take what you can, when you can. You never know when your next meal is coming. Tyler swallowed hard. This was just the beginning. The second night was worse than the first. The cold was relentless, settling deep into Tyler's bones. Even with the blanket Ray had given him, it felt like he was sleeping on ice. Every ache in his body reminded him that this wasn't a game anymore. He shifted, trying to find a comfortable position on the hard concrete, but his stomach growled in protest. The half-eaten sandwich from earlier had barely helped. He had never gone this long without a full meal. How did people survive like this? Ray sat beside him, tossing small pieces of newspaper into the dying fire. "You're feeling it now, huh?" Tyler exhaled, his breath visible in the frigid air. "I don't get it. How do you live like this?" Ray smirked. "You don't live, kid. You survive." A few feet away, a man started coughing, deep, violent, painful. Tyler turned his head, watching as the man clutched his chest, struggling for air. "Is he okay?" Tyler asked, concern creeping into his voice. Ray barely looked up. "He's been sick for weeks." Tyler frowned. "Then why isn't he at a hospital?" Ray laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think they'd take him? No insurance, no address, no money. No one cares, kid." Tyler felt something cold twist inside him. He had never thought about this before. He had always assumed hospitals helped people, but these people weren't part of the world he knew. They were invisible. Tyler leaned back against the wall, staring at the dark sky above. For the first time, the weight of his privilege truly sank in. Tomorrow, he would have to find food, and this time, no one would offer it to him. By the third day, hunger became an unbearable force. Tyler had thought he understood what it meant to be hungry before. He had skipped meals before a workout, gone on fancy juice cleanses for health, but this was different. His stomach clenched painfully, his body weak, his head light. Ray had disappeared early in the morning, leaving Tyler on his own. No money, no food, no plan. He wandered through the city, passing restaurants with their rich smells drifting into the streets. His mind screamed at him to just walk inside, take a seat, and order like he used to. But that wasn't an option anymore. Then he saw it. A half-eaten burger sitting on top of a trash bin. His stomach twisted, not just in hunger, but in shame. Could he really do this? A week ago, he would have laughed at the thought. Now, the smell of food made his dignity feel smaller than his hunger. He reached out, hesitating. His fingers hovered just over the wrapper. "Don't." The voice startled him. Ray stood a few feet away, watching. Tyler pulled his hand back, embarrassed. "I wasn't. I mean..." Ray smirked. "You were." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Lesson 3, kid. You steal from trash today. You steal from people tomorrow. That's how you lose yourself out here." Tyler swallowed hard. "Then what am I supposed to do?" Ray studied him for a long moment before sighing. "Come with me." Tyler followed him through the maze of streets until they stopped outside a soup kitchen. A long line stretched down the block, full of tired faces, hollow eyes, people just like Ray. "This is how we survive," Ray said. "You take help when it's given. No shame in that." Tyler hesitated. This was the first time he had ever stood in line for food. But as his stomach roared in protest, he swallowed his pride and stepped forward. Tyler stood in line, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, trying to shrink into himself. He could feel the stares of the others around him. Some curious, some indifferent, some too lost in their own struggles to notice him at all. He had never felt so out of place in his life. The line moved slowly, the scent of warm soup filling the air. It smelled better than anything he had ever eaten in his father's estate. Hunger had a way of making even the simplest food seem like a luxury. When he reached the front, a woman in a worn apron handed him a tray. Her face was lined with exhaustion, but her eyes were kind. "First time here?" she asked. Tyler hesitated, then nodded. She smiled. "Eat slow. It'll help." He took a seat at a long metal table, surrounded by people he had spent his life ignoring. Men who looked like they had once had everything but lost it. Women with tired, sunken eyes, clutching their children close. The kind of people he had only seen from car windows, the kind he had never thought twice about. Ray sat beside him, slurping his soup without hesitation. "Eat, kid, before someone takes it." Tyler picked up the spoon, his hands still shaking from hunger. The first bite was overwhelming. It was just vegetable soup, but it was the best thing he had tasted in his life. For the first time, he understood what it meant to be grateful for a meal. He glanced around, seeing others eating just like him. No one here was weak. No one here was lesser. They were survivors, fighters, people doing whatever it took to stay alive. Tyler swallowed hard. He had spent his whole life thinking he was above them. Now, sitting at their table, he realized he was no different. That night, as Tyler and Ray walked back toward their usual spot, the city felt different. The lights were still bright, the streets still loud, but he no longer saw them through the eyes of a privileged outsider. He saw them as someone fighting to survive. They turned into an alley where a few other homeless men had gathered around a small fire. It was their safe spot, as Ray called it. But tonight, something felt off. A man Tyler had never seen before. Tall, muscular, with a shaved head and eyes dark with anger, stood in the shadows, his fists clenched. "You been eating for free, huh, old man?" he growled, stepping toward Ray. Ray didn't flinch. "I don't want trouble, Mick." But Mick didn't care. "Nothing's free. You know how it works." Tyler watched, his stomach twisting. He had never seen real violence up close. In his world, fights were something that happened in movies, not in the streets. Mick lunged. Before Tyler could react, Ray was on the ground, coughing, gripping his ribs. Something snapped inside Tyler. Without thinking, he stepped forward. "Stop." Mick turned, narrowing his eyes. "What? You gonna stop me, rich boy?" Tyler froze. How did he know? Ray groaned, pushing himself up. "He's not like us," Mick sneered. "I can smell it on him. He doesn't belong here." Tyler clenched his fists. For the first time, he wanted to fight, not because he was proud, but because, for the first time, he wasn't fighting for himself. But before he could do anything, a group of men appeared at the end of the alley. Other homeless men, people Ray had helped. Mick looked around, realized he was outnumbered, and scoffed. "This ain't over." He turned and disappeared into the night. Ray winced, touching his ribs. "Damn, kid, you really were gonna fight, huh?" Tyler exhaled shakily. "Yeah." Ray smirked, despite the pain. "Guess you're learning." Tyler sat beside Ray, watching the fire flicker in the empty alley. His hands were still shaking, his heart still pounding from the confrontation. He had never been in a real fight before, not one that mattered. Ray let out a slow breath. "You didn't have to do that, kid." Tyler looked at him, frustration bubbling in his chest. "I couldn't just let him hurt you." Ray chuckled, wincing at the pain in his ribs. "That's how it is out here. Some people take because they got nothing left. Others, they just like power." Tyler's jaw tightened. He had seen that before. At his father's company, in the boardrooms, in the smug smiles of men who had never worked for a single thing in their lives. Ray studied him for a long moment. "You never told me your real name, kid." Tyler hesitated. For days, he had been just another nobody on the streets. But now, looking at Ray, at the people who had helped him, he felt like he owed them the truth. "Tyler Harrington." Ray raised an eyebrow. "Harrington? As in Harrington Enterprises?" Tyler nodded slowly. "Yeah." Ray let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned. And here I thought you were just another runaway." Tyler swallowed. "I guess I kind of am." Ray nodded knowingly. And what's the Prince of Wall Street doing out here with us nobodies? Tyler looked down at his hands, feeling the weight of his own answer. Trying to understand, Ray grunted. You learning anything? Tyler exhaled. More than I ever did at home. The next morning, Tyler woke to the sound of the city coming alive. The streets bustled with commuters, taxis honked impatiently, and business people in tailored suits walked past without a glance at the alley where he and Ray sat. He stretched, wincing at the soreness in his back. His body had never felt this beaten down before, but something inside him felt stronger. Ray tossed him a half-crushed granola bar. Eat up, rich boy. You got one more day left on your little adventure. Tyler chewed in silence, staring at the endless wave of people moving through the city. He had spent his whole life thinking money was everything, that success meant wealth, power, and a name that demanded respect. But out here, none of that mattered. I used to think people like you just didn't try hard enough, Tyler admitted, his voice quieter than usual. That if you really wanted to change your life, you could. Ray smirked. And now? Tyler exhaled. Now, I know the system is built to keep people like you invisible. Ray nodded. Took you long enough. For the first time, Tyler saw the world beyond the glass towers and country club parties. He saw the struggle, the resilience, the strength it took just to survive one more day. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't ashamed of what he didn't know. He was ashamed of what he had ignored. Tomorrow, he would go back to his old life. But he wouldn't be the same person anymore. As the sun dipped below the skyline, Tyler stood at the edge of the alley, looking out at the city he once thought he owned. Tomorrow, he would return to his world of privilege, of luxury, of never worrying about his next meal. But tonight, he was still one of them. Ray sat nearby, his back against the brick wall, picking at a loose thread on his jacket. He hadn't asked Tyler when he was leaving. Maybe he already knew. So, what now, rich boy? Ray finally said, his voice calm. Tyler hesitated. What now? He had spent years planning his future. Inherit the company, sit in a boardroom, spend money he never earned. But now, that life felt empty. I don't know, he admitted. Ray smirked. Well, that's a start. Tyler reached into his pocket, pulling out the single thing he had managed to keep. A crumpled $5 bill Ray had given him on his second day. He pressed it into Ray's hand. Ray frowned. What's this? A loan, Tyler said. Because I'll be back. And when I come back, I'm gonna pay it back 10 times over. Ray chuckled, shaking his head. You really think you're different now, don't you? Tyler met his gaze. Yeah, I do. Ray studied him for a moment before slipping the bill into his pocket. Then don't prove me wrong, kid. Tyler nodded, stepping back toward the main street, where a sleek black car waited at the curb. His world, his past, his future. He took one last look at Ray, at the alley, at the life he had only borrowed for a week. And then he stepped forward, carrying a new kind of wealth no money could ever buy. The moment Tyler slid into the back seat of the luxury car, the world outside felt like a dream. The leather seats, the scent of expensive cologne, the quiet hum of the engine. It was all too familiar, yet suddenly suffocating. The driver, an older man in a crisp uniform, glanced at him through the rearview mirror. Welcome back, Mr. Harrington. Tyler barely nodded. He didn't feel like Mr. Harrington anymore. As they drove through the city, he saw everything differently. The streets weren't just streets. They were home to people he had laughed at before. The alleys weren't just dirty corners. They were survival grounds. The people weren't just homeless. They were fighters, survivors, human beings. When they pulled up to the Harrington estate, the gates opened automatically, leading to a mansion that once felt like home but now seemed excessive. Inside, his father sat in the grand study, a glass of whiskey in hand. "Well, got it out of your system?" Tyler didn't answer. He just sat across from him, the weight of the past week pressing down on him. His father scoffed. "I hope you learned something." Tyler exhaled slowly. "Yeah, I did." His father smirked. "Good. Now let's talk about your place in the company." But as he spoke about business deals and quarterly profits, Tyler wasn't listening. His mind was back in the alley, back with Ray, back with the people who had shown him what real strength was. And for the first time in his life, he realized he didn't want to be the person his father had raised him to be. Tyler sat in the massive leather chair across from his father, but the room felt colder than ever. The grand fireplace, the bookshelves lined with first editions, the heavy scent of aged whiskey, none of it impressed him anymore. His father leaned forward, tapping a gold pin against his desk. "You wasted a week playing a beggar. Now it's time to get serious. The company needs you." Tyler exhaled, his fingers tightening around the armrest. "I thought the company was fine without me." His father smirked. "It is, but you're my son. It's your responsibility to keep it that way." Tyler had spent his whole life preparing for this moment, but now it felt like a prison sentence. He wasn't the same person who had walked into the streets a week ago. He couldn't unsee what he had seen. He couldn't unlearn what he had learned. "I want to do something different," he finally said. His father's expression darkened. "What do you mean, different?" Tyler took a deep breath. "I want to use our money to help people, to actually change things." A bitter laugh escaped his father's lips. "Help people? You think throwing money at the homeless will fix them? They don't need handouts, Tyler. They need to work." Tyler clenched his jaw. "That's easy for you to say. You've never lived a day in their shoes." His father's eyes narrowed. "And you have?" Tyler met his gaze without flinching. "Yeah, I have." Silence stretched between them. For the first time in his life, Tyler wasn't trying to win his father's approval. He was standing for something bigger than his last name. His father sighed, shaking his head. "Do whatever you want. Just don't drag my name into it." Tyler's lips curled into a small smile. "That's the first thing we agree on." Tyler walked out of his father's study, his heart pounding but his mind clear. For the first time in his life, he wasn't following a path that had been laid out for him. He was creating his own. He pulled out his phone and stared at the screen. He had every resource at his fingertips: connections, money, influence. But none of that mattered if he didn't know where to start. Then he thought of Ray, the man who had saved him, taught him, humbled him. Without hesitation, he dialed a number. A few rings later, Chase's voice answered. "Dude, you survived. Can't believe you actually did it." Tyler ignored his friend's laughter. "Did you make the donation?" Chase hesitated. "Yeah, man. 50 grand. Sent it this morning." Tyler exhaled, relief washing over him. That was only the beginning. "Hey, listen," he said. "I need another favor." Chase sighed. "Here we go. What now?" Tyler's grip tightened around the phone. "I need a building. Something abandoned but fixable. Somewhere people can go when they have nowhere else." There was a long pause. "You're serious?" Tyler smiled. Dead serious. For the first time, he wasn't just talking about making a difference. He was going to do it. 1 week later, Tyler stood in front of an old, abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. The bricks were worn, the windows boarded up, the sign faded beyond recognition. To most people, it looked like nothing. To him, it was a beginning. Beside him, Ray let out a low whistle. "You serious about this, kid?" Tyler nodded. "Dead serious." Chase had pulled through. The building was his. But buying it was the easy part. Turning it into something that mattered would take time, effort, and more than just money. Ray crossed his arms. "You don't know the first thing about running a shelter." Tyler smirked. "And you do?" Ray chuckled. "I know what people out here need. And it ain't just a roof over their heads." Tyler took a deep breath, staring at the building. "Then teach me." Ray studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, rich boy. Let's do this." For the first time in his life, Tyler wasn't working to impress his father. He wasn't chasing power, wealth, or status. He was chasing something real, a purpose, a second chance, not for himself, but for the people who had given him one. And this time, he wouldn't fail.